Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me, Dr. Lesley Hawson, on this, my final presentation for 2023. In this presentation, we're going to talk about something that has fascinated me ever since I first clocked eyes on a horse when I was 7. This is a picture of Clever Hans. He was a horse owned and trained by a guy called Wilhelm von Osten in 1900. Essentially, Clever Hans could do maths. He used his hoof to tap answers to complex questions, including those such as what is the square root of 9? Nobody could prove fraud. He was investigated by all sorts of people. Hans seemed to have the mathematical ability of a 14-year-old human. Finally, in 1904, the horse was examined by a committee headed by a professor of philosophy, who reported that they could find no evidence of direct signalling. People flocked to see Hans perform. Then a psychologist named Funkst investigated it. He asked the question, would Hans know the answer if only he could see the questions? Hans now repeatedly got the questions wrong. Hans was detecting very subtle clues that predicted the correct answer, not only from his trainer, but also those people watching him. This is an example of classical conditioning. Horses are absolute champions of reading people and making associations between the signal and their own behaviour and the consequences arising out of that behaviour. This is what we're going to talk about today. Now, before we get started, I do want to say it is impossible to cover everything about how horses learn in a single lecture. I have been studying this very question all my life, and I still need to know very much more. I will be covering a lot of information, so those of you more learned in certain areas may find some of the information here a bit broad brush. Fortunately, there is a plethora of resources now available online and through some very good training portals. I have provided some resources at the end of this lecture that you might want to follow up if your interest has been piqued. Be warned though, learning about learning can be very addictive. First, the good news. At the molecular and neurological level, horses, being mammals, learn the same way we do. Again, like all mammals, horses apparently learn in straightforward and predictable ways because of the neurological architecture and chemistry that makes up the mammalian brain. The bad news is, although we know a bit about how it all works, we still do not know a lot. But, like all things, we are learning rapidly. See what I did there? That was a pun, people. It's all downhill from here. Learning theory is an approach that explains changes in behaviour produced by mental and/or physical practice, as opposed to other factors such as physiological development and modal action patterns. That's the fancy name for instincts. Like many theories in science with a capital T, learning theory has been tested and examined using the scientific method to the point that there has been enough evidence accumulated to use learning theory to not only explain many aspects of learning, but also to use it to predict outcomes for learning. Understanding learning theory and its biological underpinnings help us to work with our horses that expedites learning and keeps both us and the horse safer. Despite being called theory, the processes involved in learning theory are rooted in measurable changes at the level of communications between individual neurons in the central nervous system, and over time, changes in the neuronal structures and how they communicate right across the nervous system. Both processes take energy, which is why learning for all mammals is tiring. It takes time to build the structures that support longer-term learning and protein. Lots of protein. Much of our understanding of learning theory comes from experiments on laboratory animals. The basic physiology of learning means that how learning occurs can be identified, planned for, and ultimately exploited. The magic of our interaction with horses is that we have a unique relationship, i.e., ridden and/or driven. This provides a rich reservoir to examine communication between two species based on a complicated interaction of reinforcement, both addition and removal of pressures, as well as arousal, emotional state, and attachment. It's complicated. The basic learning unit is the specialised nerve cells in the central nervous system, the neuron. The neuron, like all cells, has electrical charge. The difference is that the neuron can change the polarity of its cell membrane in response to stimulation. Stimulation happens at the specialised receiving parts of the cell called dendrites. If enough stimulation occurs, the cell membrane changes charge, and just like an electric circuit, the charge travels through the neuron along a specialised protuberance called the axon. It is axons that make up the nerve tracts in animals, and in the horse, the axons of some neurons, particularly motor neurons, are over 1.5 metres long, as they travel from the central nervous system down to the hind leg hoof. However, it is at the connections between neurons where things get really interesting. If the electrical strength is strong enough when it reaches the end of the axon, it will stimulate the cell to release special chemicals that track over the gap to the neuron on the other side. The gap is called a synapse. If enough of these special chemicals, called neurotransmitters, arrive on the receiving neuron, then it will depolarize or fire, and the message travels through the nerve cell, and so on. This is how movement and ultimately all behaviour that we can see is created. At each of the transitions between electrical and chemical communication, there is an opportunity to go or no go. This adds variability and complexity. And to add to the confusion, there are neurons and neurotransmitters that are inhibitory. If they are in play, it is harder for the neuron to fire. So, the more the horse practices in its behaviour in a way that the synapses fire, the stronger the connections between the two cells become. The first time a horse trials a response that gets a reinforcement, a payoff, there might only be a few packets of messengers or neurotransmitters between the critical neurons. Still enough to make the receiving neuron fire, but not a very strong message. It's like having just a single zip line across a cavern or a valley. Behaviourally, we might see that the horse has looked at a target, for example. It's a first attempt. As the horse practices the same stimulus behaviour loop and gets reinforcement for the stimulus response, more message packets are sent across the synapses between the neurons. This is like the middle picture of buckets on a thin line going across the gap. There is more quantity of neurotransmitters travelling between the two neurons. Now the neuronal connection is beginning to show that this particular firing pattern is good for survival. With each stimulus behaviour reinforcement chain, more and more synapses from different neurons are recruited because the behaviour chain is repeated. So we can think of the first time a connection is made as being like a single rope across a ravine. Then the next time there are two ropes, and eventually, if the connection is practiced enough, the crossing between two previously unconnected synapses is a Sydney-Harbour Bridge-size connection. As you can imagine, building these connections and sending messenger proteins across the synapses, followed by the propagation of the message through the neuron, is quite energy sapping for the individual cell. And long-term changes takes time, energy, and again protein. Learning horses need protein. What happens next is even more energy demanding. Most neurons are equipped with the machinery to change the number and type of neurotransmitters being released at the synapses and stimulate the growth of more synapses. They have specialised structures designed to grow out to make more synapses with other neurons. And neurons that are firing a lot put out chemical messages to say, "Come on over, I'm onto a good thing here." So not only are more neurotransmitters sent across the synapse, literally more synapses get built, so the wiring between the neurons becomes more powerful, and more neurons are roped in to participate in what has become a useful behavioural pattern. This is what strengthens learning even more, to the point that the changes are grossly detectable in terms of the number of neurons and their connections in the brain. What begins as a tiny thread of electrical impulses between neurons that are not connected becomes a superhighway of learned responses. Over time, and with more learning, the neuronal highways become even more interconnected, with branches from other wiring patterns, including hardwired neurological behaviour patterns such as reflexes. For example, horses have to learn not to kick through habituation. They can even modify modal action patterns. Remember, that's the fancy name for instincts. So the learned behaviour often overrides or inhibits other behaviours. Please note that wiring that is not used regularly will get reduced or pruned back to the single zip line connection, so that the materials can be recycled to the connections that are paying off now. This is an important part of the amazing plasticity that makes up the nervous system. That said, as we all know, horses have amazing memories. Once they have learnt a rewarding behavioural pattern, they do not seem to degrade it as much as we do. Add in the fact that different parts of the brain itself have different functions, you begin to get some idea of the complexity involved in functioning and learning. The picture here on the right is taken from a paper only published in March of this year. It is the first time a full connectome, i.e. a map of all the neuronal wiring of any brain, has been mapped. And this is the connectome of a larval fruit fly. Note, as it is a larva, there has been no environmental learning overlaid on the map. It's just going to get more complicated from here. So learning happens in the brain, but different parts of the brain perform different types of functions and therefore play different roles in learning. It is never a straightforward linear relationship in neuroscience. Differences in how the brain is structured helps give us some broad concepts of how learning in horses differs from we humans. The image on the left is from an amazing paper that is the first to give us a full 3D MRI image of the horse's brain. What always strikes me when I look at brain images is how alike our brains are rather than how different they are. That said, there are differences, and for today's presentation, the most important difference is in the regions of the prefrontal cortex. This part of brain is responsible for reasoning, problem solving, comprehension, impulse control, creativity, and perseverance. The prefrontal cortex is a recognised structure, i.e. collection of specialised neurons in the frontal lobe of the brain. It is present in both brain hemispheres. Humans have a whopping 33% of the neocortex, i.e. the most recently developed part of the brain evolutionary-wise devoted to the PFC. Species such as dogs have only 10% and cats 4%. I could not find any figures for horses specifically, but presumably, given their evolutionary history, they would not have any more than our other companion workmates. The sheer geographical area devoted to the PVC in the horse appears quite small, and horses do not have a ventrolateral frontal lobe or a lateral frontal pole in the area where the prefrontal cortex is, that humans do. It is likely that horses do have some PFC functioning, but it cannot be as much or as dominant as the PFC in humans. It would be safe to say that it is unlikely that horses have the same amount of capacity for impulse control or reasoning. To ascribe problem solving and conceptual manipulation to these animals is unfair of us. When you say to your horse, "It's just a wheelie bin, you idiot," it means nothing. We are layering context and meaning onto the wheelie bin that the horse has absolutely no context or ability to process. Where the PFC is important is that it has roles in initiating voluntary motor control and recognising reward reinforcement. Both these activities would appear to be very much present in the horse and play important roles in learning. Another area where horses appear to differ to humans is in memory. Humans have a prospective memory, so we can visualise events forwards and backwards. We can play with and manipulate our memories according to our mood, need, and the context at the time of recall. But in doing so, we change the memory, so we are often remembering our last memory of the event. And each time, our PFC changes the memory according to the situational requirements of the recall process. We are not aware of this process, but it certainly explains how everyone has a different interpretation of what happened when, even if we are all there at the time. Horses, in contrast, probably do not have the same faculties. They may even have a fairly more direct memory call with less top-down interference. Some researchers propose that horses have an episodic total recall type of memory, which explains their ability to make associations so quickly and respond to context or environment with such conviction. Perhaps they remember like a sense surround experience. So it is no wonder they react like they do when a memory is triggered by sensory input. Coupling events with emotions results in powerful learning. There are many structures dedicated to functions associated with memory and learning in the brain, apart from the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is a complex of interwoven structures that makes up a bridge between the body and its autonomic functions and the cerebral cortex, which is the top of the brain. It is made up of many complex structures, including the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, and of particular importance for those of us dealing with horses, the amygdala. One of the main jobs of the amygdala is to permanently store fear responses. Fear seems to have its own memory system, to the point that once it is established, it is impossible to extinguish. This makes sense. A learned fear means the horse survived a fearful situation. A horse that does not learn from such a situation is a dead horse in the wild. Horses have the biggest amygdala by volume amongst all domestic species. This may explain some of their innate fearfulness and why, once a fear response has been learned, e.g. the scary corner in the arena, it is very hard to overcome. Fear is the trainer's enemy. Inducing fear tips horses into the distress zone of arousal. This inhibits learning and performance. Although fear is particularly unproductive in terms of learning, any form of over-arousal will reduce learning. This is known as the Yerkes-Dodson curve. Effective learning can only take place at the right level of arousal. Training methods that encourage engagement by the horse are more effective for longer than command and control approaches. Because learning is so energy sapping, it is important to recognise that horses cannot maintain the optimal arousal levels for learning as long as humans. Even highly trained adult horses will struggle to maintain the appropriate level of arousal when learning new behaviours for longer than about 5 minutes. Be gentle on your horse. Don't drill him. In fact, repeating a learned response over and over will gradually detrain it as the horse becomes frustrated that his previously successful behaviours are not stopping the requests from his trainer. This is particularly the case when employing negative reinforcement. Calmness has long been recognised as an important element of learning. From Grisoni in 1559, de la Grenadier in 1733, and even the German National Equestrian Federation. Learning does require some arousal, but too much arousal for the task in hand will inhibit learning. Simple, previously well-learned tasks can be successfully performed at higher levels of arousal, while actively learning new cognitively demanding tasks requires lower arousal. This is why it is always good to fall back to previously learned skills when the horse begins to demonstrate signs of confusion or conflict. Factors that help maintain a learning level of arousal include predictability. The horse can predict the outcome of the behavioural situation. Controllability. The animal can control the situation through its behaviour to achieve the desired outcome. The outcome may be to lower a physiological drive such as thirst, or reduce a stimulus to an acceptable level, move away from a pressure cue. We will shortly discuss whether it is the reduction in drive itself that is reinforcing, or the fact that the horse predicted that by behaving in a certain way it would have a drive reduction. More soon. The recent development of scent work for horses is an example of how we humans need to extend our own worldview to match that of our equine companions. Why don't we use olfaction to train more? The telos of the horse, its evolutionary history as a social, vagile, which means moving, plains grazer that relied on flight as its principal defence mechanism, defines not only how a horse interacts with its environment through its senses, but how it prioritises learning. Horses use sound, sight, olfaction, touch and taste to explore and learn from its environment. This gives us a vast array of modalities which we can communicate with them. But we have to create communications in a way that is salient, that is, important, noticeable, of interest to the horse, so that it will attend or notice the communication attempts. All horses are neophobic. Neophobia is being fearful of the unfamiliar and really is a telltale feature of prey animals. Stimuli that are large, close and moving fast are often big predators that eat complacent horses. That said, complete neophobia is of course counterproductive in terms of survival, so horses that are blessed with curiosity to a greater or lesser degree. It is these differences that are captured when we consider the effect of personality or temperament of the individual horse. Personality or temperament is a genetically based defined combination of traits. But like all things at the individual level, it can be modified by experience and environment. Curiosity, mentioned previously, is at the other end of the fearfulness continuum. There has been a fair bit of research into the horse's personality or temperament. It is seen as a relatively stable combination of traits that is predictable across time. Each of the traits exists along a continuum, and a horse will tend to exhibit behaviours consistent with its combination of traits. The 4 traits that are currently agreed to form part of the horse's temperament are fearfulness, also known as reactivity, anxiousness, excitability, calmness and emotionality; gregariousness, reaction to and separation from specifics. Too much gregariousness can lead to separation anxiety. The third one is reactivity to humans. This is a measure of whether the horse seeks human contact. Gregariousness to people or friendliness to people. Sensory sensitivity seems to be another consistent trait. It's not clearly understood, but it does appear that individual animals have different preferences for what sense they receive cues through. The area of personality or temperament, as I mentioned, is a hot topic in equine research. Some researchers separate character from temperature in terms of stability of the trait over time. The 4 traits listed here appear to be a fairly consistent component of the horse's makeup. Remember, they are all a continuum, and your horse will have a unique combination of traits. The important thing to remember is that the individual's personality will impact on the antecedents in play during training interactions, which is all the time. We are always training because we experience them and they experience us. Now we're going to get really sciencey. In recent times, it has been recognised that it is the prediction of the consequences of their actions that makes animals not only motivated to trial behaviours, but can inform how salient, i.e. important, they find the stimuli. Stimuli that consistently predict the reward for the consequent behaviour are found to be more salient, so the animal pays more attention to them and even finds the stimulus itself rewarding, in that there is a dopamine spike when they recognise it. Dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter. It makes you feel good, and it seems to facilitate release of other messengers in the brain. When a horse predicts that a behaviour is going to be rewarding and it does not receive the reinforcement, then the horse is said to have made a prediction error. Dopamine release is inhibited. The experience is disappointing. Prediction error is thought to cause animals to pay much closer attention to identifying the stimuli that more accurately predicts behaviour and consequent reinforcement contingency. It also explains the apparent contradiction that has long been recognised in learning. Learners attend most to stimuli that are reliable predictors of a rewarding behaviour, but also, seemingly paradoxically, learners pay equal, if not more, attention to stimuli that result in very surprising or fear-inducing consequences. In this latter circumstance, the prediction error is very large, and the animal is very motivated to retain the memory of how the unpredictable event could be predicted. This is a very basic description of the role of prediction error in animal learning, but it is an exciting area of research, particularly as it opens the door for negative reinforcement techniques associated with riding to create feel-good experiences for horses, rather than the simple acquiescence to adverse stimuli. Watch this space. Modern animal behaviour practitioners use the terms antecedents, behaviour, and consequences as a practical shorthand to describe the relationship between stimulus, response, and reinforcement. Behaviour doesn't just randomly occur, nor does it be performed in a void. Behaviour always has a function. The function of any particular behaviour is related to the environment stimuli that precede it and the consequences that follow the behaviour. Antecedents are those events or conditions that immediately precede a behaviour. They set the occasion for the behaviour to occur. Not all antecedents are functional, just those specifically related to or actively impacting on the ensuing behaviour at that particular moment. The wily trainer is always considering the antecedents in play at any time in a training session. It is important to recognise behaviour is what the horse actually does, not what the horse is. Just as we cannot really know what any person is feeling or thinking, we certainly cannot know what a horse is feeling. The most we can do is make inferences about how effective our learning setup is by how enthusiastically the horse is engaging in the learning and participating in the training. Consequences are increasingly being defined as whether the predicted outcome occurred and if the predicted outcome was worthy of all the energy put into achieving the consequences. This feeds back into the antecedents and contributes to the information the horse will use to decide if it wants to engage in the learning exercise. Is it worth its while in light of all the antecedent information available? How likely is it that I will get reinforcement? That is the prediction part of learning. The advantage of recognising the actual reinforcement process happens inside the horse's central nervous system means that we can tailor our reinforcement to the type of training and what is important to the horse at that time. We have to work hard to make the reinforcements that we use valuable to the horse and work on our timing and actual reinforcement delivery to ensure that we are optimising the value to the horse to minimise prediction error. It all gets more complicated as we try to minimise frustration, i.e. greater prediction error, while shaping the initial attempt of behaviour to the final desired behaviour. There is quite a bit of work coming out of zoo animal training on error-free training, and I urge you to indulge in listening to some of the fantastic podcast programs that are filling the airways on these type of practical solutions to making training encouraging and safe for all parties. We're now going to have a quick race through the learning processes that the horses use to interact with the world. As the horse is a domesticated animal, it is not unusual for humans to hijack and use the learning processes to obtain behaviours from the horse that suit we humans. Habituation is a very important evolutionary tool. All animals are bombarded by stimuli from the environment all the time. If an animal was to respond to all these stimuli all the time, they would quickly die of exhaustion. Habituation allows the animal to filter out the stimuli that are meaningless to the animal's well-being and allocates the animal's cognitive energy to the stimuli that do count. Getting horses habituated to wearing rugs is a classic example of this type of learning. There are several ways that you can use habituation. The first is, and the most preferred, is systemic desensitisation. It is a very gradual approach and very common. It's an adaptation from psychotherapy when we apply it in training the horse. The horse is exposed to low levels of arousing stimuli and rewarded when it stays relaxed to whatever the response we are looking for. An increase in the level of stimulus is not made until the animal reliably fails to react at the previous level. Another form of habituation is counter-conditioning or response substitution. This is often used in combination with systemic desensitization. Basically, you offer another option such as food and eating as an alternative behaviour to responding to the original problem stimuli. It has the advantage that if it is done skillfully, the horse will start to associate the presentation of the adverse stimuli, such as clippers, with a reward. I used this approach to get my young horse to take the bit into his mouth. He was very resistant about it, but fortunately he's also very food motivated. Now, when I give the cue bit in, he actually puts the bit into his mouth and gets a food reward as a consequence. Overshadowing is another way to habituate. This is where you use the premise of learning theory that the least important stimulus gets no attention when two stimuli are presented at the same time. An example would be training the horse to offer head down rather than wriggling around with the farrier. The head down action takes precedence over moving the horse's feet. The final and very common, sadly, method of desensitization in the horse world is technically called response prevention, but we may also know it as the term flooding. It should be avoided at all costs, as it can easily strengthen fears through inadvertent reinforcement of undesirable behaviours such as running away, or the development of learned helplessness where the horse becomes shut down and non-responsive because they cannot escape the overwhelming stimulus. In the latter case, the horse may appear to tolerate the aversive stimuli, but its welfare is severely compromised, as demonstrated by the fact they often have very high heart rates. And there is always the risk that the horse will explosively react with warning. As they are not really habituated, they are just shut down. Approach conditioning is a way that exploits the horse's natural curiosity. The object of fear or concern moves away from the horse when the horse is asked to approach it. It's kind of a fun, modified systemic desensitization with a bit of fun thrown in. Stimulus blending is blending the adverse stimuli with one the horse does tolerate. There's actually quite a good video on YouTube showing how this can be done when you want to get horses used to an aerosol, such as for fly spray. Horses with a different temperament combination may respond to different approaches, so no one size fits all. The key to all desensitization learning is to not exceed the horse's fear threshold in the process. This is why flooding is considered unethical and the results in unacceptable welfare compromise. Sensitization is the opposite of habituation. It is what enables the animal to focus selectively on stimuli that lead to pain, fear, drive reduction, and very importantly for training, dopamine release. Sensitization is an important survival strategy and provides much of the training process in domesticated horses. Horses are incredibly good at noticing the smallest thing and focusing on it. We ask a lot of our horses. We expect them to ignore the pressure of our legs on their sides, i.e. habituation, until we imply an increase in pressure, which they are expected to notice and respond to appropriately. Similarly, they must accept or habituate to the bit in their mouth, but be sensitive to small increases in bit pressure in their mouths. This is a source of much confusion, conflict behaviour, and yet is the basis of much of our ridden or driven horse training. Sensitization often occurs as a result of a horse experiencing pain or fear in conjunction with a stimulus. Sensitization is marked by the increasingly extreme reaction to stimuli. In horses, it can lead to what in humans we would label as an amygdala hijack. An amygdala hijack occurs when the amygdala receives information from the memory stored in the hippocampus that a stimulus represents a fight, flight, or freeze situation, so that the amygdala triggers the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the endocrine system for putting the body into fight, flight, or freeze. In this situation, the amygdala takes precedence over any inhibitory messaging from the neocortex. Remember, the horse does not have a well-developed neocortex and is particularly lacking in the prefrontal cortex, which often exerts an inhibitory influence on the amygdala. In humans, amygdala hijacks often result in behaviour that is irrational or destructive, such as what we saw at the Academy Awards when Will Smith hit Chris Rock. How often have we seen a horse behave in a self-destructive manner? Are they victims of amygdala hijack? Horses are brilliant at making associations or connections between events. It is both their superpower and their downfall. Unfortunately, as we all know, jumping to conclusions can be reckless, but this is where the lack of a highly developed prefrontal cortex causes problems for the horse. Being grazing animals, they don't really need to think too hard about whether that patch of grass is a good idea or not. Classical conditioning is simply the formation of association between a neutral stimuli and a biologically significant stimuli that results in a significant response. Pavlov's dogs are the classic example. You can see it with your horses that start pawing at their feed buckets when you appear. The behaviours that are stimulated by feed being delivered to the horse are now stimulated by the sight of you, the bipedal feed vending machine arriving at the paddock. It is easy to imagine how the neuronal connections are made to produce this relationship, although, as in all things neuroscience, the reality is far, far more complicated. That said, classical conditioning is the mainstay of much of our training. Any horse that responds to voice cues has learned to do so via classical conditioning. The process of learning through classical conditioning can come to rely on imperceptible cues such as the seat cues of the rider. Unfortunately, classical conditioning can also result in horses making associations leading to unwanted behaviour if the human is not aware of how they are communicating their intentions. Operant conditioning is the basis of much horse training. It gets its name from the fact that the learner is operating on its learning environment. Operant conditioning is defined as adding or subtracting desirable or undesirable stimuli to increase or decrease the likelihood of a response. I hesitated to put the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning up, as it is increasingly being recognised that the divisions between them are not clear. For example, it is easy for negative reinforcement to bleed into positive punishment if we do not keep the stimuli that we were using at a non-painful or non-fear-inducing level. Positive punishment is not ethical because there is increasing evidence that does not work very well in horses due to their fast default to fear and flight and their inability to associate the pain caused by punishment with the preceding action. They just don't look back at their actions like we do. Negative punishment is equally inequitable, and when training can lead to frustration in the horse, especially the enthusiastic learners, that ultimately results in shutdown and a poor training outcome. It is tricky stuff. There is a little bit of research that suggests that negative reinforcement in the horse is more effective than positive reinforcement in some situations. There can be a variety of reasons for this, not the least past experience. The horses use negative reinforcement in their interspecies communications via numerous social interactions. Horses may be predisposed to move away from pressure, for example. Positive reinforcement for simple actions is part and parcel of the horse's everyday. You put your head down, you're immediately rewarded by some grass, but you might need a bit more of a nudge to move away from said grass. Most traditional training uses operant conditioning in order to train the horse. Tactile cues such as pressure on the lead rope, halter or bridle are used to elicit the desired behavioural response, and reinforcement is in the form of taking away the pressure when the horse provides that response. It should be noted it is impossible to avoid aversive stimuli in horse training, since any novel stimuli can be initially aversive. Even just being within the flight zone of some horses is aversive. That said, aversive denotes something that the animal wants to avoid. It is not necessarily overly frightening or painful. In good training, an aversive stimuli is usually just vaguely annoying. In optimal training, the stimulus becomes less intense until the cue is so mild as to be unnoticeable to the observer. Voice cues, body postural cues, and even visual cues can be instilled over the operant cue to become classically conditioned trained responses. This is where the difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning becomes apparent. Operant cues can be increased in intensity so they become more averse to the horse in order to motivate a response. Classically conditioned cues cannot. That means when a horse does not respond to a previously trained classical cues such as increased seat pressure to slow down, the rider will have to resort to the operant cue of increased rein tension resulting in bit pressure. Positive reinforcement has been typically poorly administered in horse training owing to anthropomorphic belief systems and, quite frankly, overestimation of equine cognitive abilities. Thankfully, due to pioneering efforts by people such as Alexandra Curlin, this is training. Clicker training is the most common form of addition training in the horse world. Clicker training describes the use of a secondary positive reinforcement using a specific click sound that emanates from a handheld device. Once the association between the sound of the clicker and a primary positive reinforcer, typically a small food item, has been achieved via classical conditioning, the method can be used to train horses to perform a range of exercises from basic responses in hand and under saddle to more complex behaviours such as trailer loading and even high school dressage movements. Scratching or stroking horses on the neck appears to be another form of primary reinforcement. Attention is primarily rewarding for dogs, and some researchers have suggested the same may exist for horses. Sankey in 2010 found that food is still a stronger reinforcer, but that does not mean touch cannot work, and let's face it, it's far more convenient when riding. Wither scratching is an affiliative behaviour and mimics allogrooming. Patting or slapping the horse has been shown to cause exhilaration and may even be associated with positive additive punishment. So get the rubbing on and become habituated to having horse dirt under your fingernails. Positive punishment is adding a stimulus that results in the horse being less likely to produce the behaviour. To be effective in learning, the punishing stimulus must be contingent with the behaviour it is intended to suppress. That is, it is delivered in such a way, in terms of time and the exhibition of the behaviour, that the horse can easily make the connection between the behaviour and the punishing stimuli. Sadly, I do not believe humans are fast enough to do this, and the consequent fear and confusion punishment elicits in the horse far outweighs any perceived advantage. Electric fences are the only thing I can think of that works as punishment for horses. They are so effective that the horse actually starts to look for indicators that the fence is there and electrified prior to receiving the punishment. After the first and occasionally second shock, all horses will avoid touching the fence. Negative punishment is taking something away that is salient to the horse, and the horse can make the connection between the removal of the stimuli and its behaviour. I do not believe that horses have this capacity, as it infers a self-knowledge that may require more prefrontal cortex than the horse has. Horses did not evolve to be ridden or led. Any discomfort exerted by humans is like to be significantly inconvenient. When negative reinforcement training of horses is augmented by secondary positive reinforcement, the actual mechanism of learning should be termed combined reinforcement. Combined reinforcement has been shown to be useful in many training situations. Given the high death and serious injury rates of humans in horse-human interactions, the relative salience of positive, negative and combined reinforcement protocols in challenging situations needs to be explored. In many ways, the lines between so-called positive and negative, addition and subtraction reinforcement is very clouded. Returning to the electric fence example, do they work because the horse is deterred by the threat of electric shock, i.e. positive punishment, or is it rewarding by moving away from the electric shock, negative reinforcement? In cases of positive reinforcement, the trainer is withholding the food and delivering when deemed appropriate. So from the horse's point of view, it is negatively punished through its inability to get the food at will. And this may account for some documented behaviour issues that are associated with the periodic presentation of food stimuli, such as aggression and ritualistic behaviour. Seat pressure in the ridden horse, is it classical conditioning or negative reinforcement? For those of you who wonder what this picture is about, I have a system where I always give the horse a food treat once I've got on them from the mounting block. I've found it really increases their keenness to stand still at the mounting block. Combining reinforcement strategies does seem to work quite well with horses. Applying simultaneous but contradictory stimuli or cues do not. It forces the horse to pick the most salient stimulus and respond to that. In doing so, the ignored stimulus becomes less salient and consequently detrained. This type of problem is often seen in horse sports where increased rein tension is applied at the same time as leg cues associated with acceleration are employed. Applying simultaneous stimuli that are congruent can also cause problems. Learning theory dictates blocking will occur. The two cues become irretrievably linked as having to be applied at the same time, and they cease to work by themselves. This does not seem to occur in the special situation around the ridden horse, where rein cues are often applied at the same time as seat cues. And yet rein cues will still work without the classically conditioned seat cue. What is going on here? Perhaps rein cues are so strongly aversive that they work regardless. Seat cues, being classically conditioned, are always at risk of failure. It is an area of intense interest to equitation scientists. As you'll see in this picture, the rider is applying both leg and rein cues. This is quite a famous incident involving Saint Boy at the pentathlon competition at the recent Olympics, and has consequently resulted in the ridden phase being taken out of the modern pentathlon. It is an extreme example of how understanding, learning and training in horses has a direct relationship to social license to operate. Conflict behaviours associated with negative reinforcement occur when the forces used as stimuli, such as the halter bit, rider's legs, spurs and whips, are so great as to be painful, or the stimulus is not removed appropriately to provide the horse with the all-important prediction error feedback, and can lead to hyperreactive behaviours similar to that seen with sensitisation, as the horse attempts to escape the stimulus that is now turned into a stressor. Conflict behaviours can range from the seemingly blind panic associated with the previously discussed amygdala hijack to the shut-down horse that apparently refuses to respond to cues. Many in the horse world would identify these behaviours as resistances or evasions, as if the horse is somehow deliberately and cognitively scheming to thwart the human. The horse may become labelled using value-laden human-based descriptors such as arrogant or naughty, when in reality what we're seeing are behaviours associated with fear and or confusion. Always label behaviours for what they are, behaviours. The use of aversive stimuli in horse training can only be ethically sustainable within the context of negative reinforcement, where the aversive pressure is preceded by a classically conditioned cue such as light pressure or voice, and must cease when the correct response is offered. The removal of rein pressure particularly requires considerable skill in the riding the moving horse in various gaits. Research has shown that the release of rein pressure should occur at the onset of the desired behaviour, which may be difficult to recognise or predict, and indeed can lead to training confusion. Behaviours indicative of conflict or stress increase if release of pressure is too late for learning to occur. One wonders what the horse in this picture is learning and how far from its prediction error calculation it is at this time. Horses seem to be more time sensitive than dogs in this area. They require a quick and more contingent reinforcement. It is also made difficult that the horse's own movement makes it hard to perceive the start of the response and to deliver precise signals. A stable leg and seat position, i.e. matching the centre of mass with the horse's centre of mass, is critical for good training. Horses are super learners. They would not have moulded their way into being the helpmate and tool for humans over the eons otherwise. Reinforcement happens inside the horse's brain. They may be using a training paradigm of stimuli, behaviour and consequences you are not even aware of. Always give them the benefit of the doubt and ask yourself the question, what are the reinforcements or payoff this horse is getting out of this behaviour? In the constructional approach to animal training, focus is placed on replacing the undesirable behaviours with desired responses rather than trying to extinguish unwanted behaviours. This approach is clever because it uses our understanding of predictive error learning to provide opportunities for the animal to develop new behaviours that work better than what they are currently offering. Indeed, the payout may be the same, but the behaviour to obtain the payoff is different and often less energy intense. See the reference by Barbara Heinrich at the end of this presentation for more information. Remember, the more a horse expresses a behaviour, the more likely it is to be repeated because of those superhighways being formed in its central nervous system. Thank you so much for listening to this long presentation. I hope you've got some information out of it. And always remember, when in doubt, get help with your training. Thank you.